Okay.
I was just watching this on the phone, and Jeff, I think that's live.
Did Jeff tell you?
Just
Shall we
waiting for him
start?
to. I'm waiting for him to say yes, but I think we're there.
All right. Shall we just begin?
Yeah, I think we shall.
Okay. So to everyone who was observing, we were just getting through a little bit of a technical glitch there, but you have successfully arrived at our conversation. This is about getting high-speed rail in California finished in 5 years. Now, that may sound a little crazy. Can we really do it in 5 years? But let's just go over a little history here. So in 1962, President Kennedy said, we will go to the moon before the decade is out. 6 years later, humans traveled to the moon, and a year after that, they walked on the moon. The Transcontinental Railroad was built in 6 years, and they started construction during the Civil War. I would say that's a pretty big socioeconomic challenge for starting a big project. And then in our lifetimes, in just the last 15 years, China has built, and I still look at this number and I'm like, how is this even possible? 25,000 miles of high-speed rail. So when we talk about what's possible, what's impossible, clearly we could finish California's high-speed rail system in 5 years. It can be done. It's within the realm of physical possibilities. The United States could pull this off. We've pulled off greater challenges than this. So let's start this conversation with Boris Lipkin, who basically is in charge of construction for Northern California with the California High-Speed Rail Authority. Boris, if I wrote you a check for, and I think the estimate is something like $100 billion right now, I'm gonna get my checkbook out, start writing. How long would it take? What are the challenges? How are we gonna get this project done faster? And I guess you can start out by saying, where are we right now for people who need to know that?
Sure, thanks, Roger. I'm happy to jump in and help sort of maybe set the stage a little bit for this conversation. So as you mentioned, my role is the Northern California Regional Director for the High-Speed Rail Authority as I oversee the project from basically San Francisco out to Merced County. And just to give a sense of where things stand today, right now the authority has 119 miles under construction in Central Valley. So you can see the bridge behind me. And that's one of the structures and that was actually completed at this point. And we anticipate the first construction package out of that 119 miles to actually finish in the coming weeks. Contributors towards the electrification of the Caltrain corridor. And that 50 miles is well on its way. It will be largely ready for high-speed rail by next year. At the same time, between San Francisco and Los Angeles, so the rest of the system as we go out from the valley into the Bay Area and down to the Los Angeles Basin, we have over 400 miles of that environmentally cleared at this point. We have one section left between Palmdale and Burbank, and we anticipate finishing that environmental clearance by the end of this year, basically. So how we're doing this is, and with the support of the current administration, we're advancing the program in building blocks with the available funds that we have right now. The focus is on getting trains running in the Central Valley as soon as we can, where the construction is ongoing, and then continue to advance the work to expand out and be ready for the funding that we might need. And to your question about the big check, certainly funding is needed to get out of the valley and to the Bay Area and to Southern California. So that's sort of where we're at. That's what's on our plate. We have the way we're doing this is in building blocks, as I mentioned. But I guess maybe to kick off a little bit of the conversation around some of the hurdles, if you will, and I can start there and we could talk about some of them, but in more detail. Some of the big things, of course, is funding is the first one, because if you don't have full funding, not only can you just simply not do the work, but you also end up dealing with a lot of complexity around prioritizing work. So what should we do now? What should we do next? And those are discussions that can take a long time and obviously involve more than just us as the authority. It involves a broader constituency that has views on those kinds of prioritization and setting of those priorities. Other challenges, are when we build even the portions that are already in construction, when we are dealing with hundreds and sometimes thousands of different veto points, essentially, from or at least hurdles from third parties. It's requirements and things that create either blackout windows in construction because an irrigation district might be needing to use their facility that we intersect in some way in a very specific timing tied to the growing season, for example, or BNSF might have a moratorium on the last couple months of the year when we can't, because that's when all the holiday shopping and shipping happens. There's permitting requirements and other things that all kind of add up to the narrowing of construction windows of when you can actually do work. And now all of those are based on important values that we have, prior rights, of endangered species and other things. But those are all the things that are the push and pull on how quickly you can do something. And then the last kind of couple of things I'll mention, of course, is just the construction industry scale. If you talk about $100 billion over 5 years, that's roughly $20 billion a year. That's not insignificant to the scale of California's construction industry, which is about $900 billion a year or so in terms of its total. And so we're talking about some pretty big numbers. It's a question of, can that level of construction happen in that kind of time frame? And then I'll mention
even if we had the money, we wouldn't necessarily have the labor force to do it. Is that,
for example?
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Well,
Carter.
and I'm going to hop in on this. Carter Laffin. I'm a transportation advocate. I've fought statewide efforts across California on a lot of fronts. Most recently was heavily involved with the effort to save kind of traditional or regional transit, BART, community, things like that. Labor shortages are a very common thing that happen across the board in every sector. And when we talk about like the money thing or things like that, like there are people in other parts of the United States who would absolutely love to come to California and do the work. When we talk about, the Transcontinental Railroad coming out, there was a labor shortage in Promontory Point, Utah. People move with this. And I think it's important when we're talking about the context within California of, $20 billion a year. That's the highway budget. California on a regular basis without blinking an eye spends $20 billion on that. And, yes, there are things, but this is one of those parts, as Boris is saying, when we prioritize it more, it can happen a lot faster because we say, okay, well, now we have some people who maybe were working on, they were pouring concrete on construction highway projects, and now they're doing it on the high-speed rail. Maybe there were people who were finishing up in Florida on Brightline, and now they're coming out to California. Like that's, there's plenty of people out there.
Or even internationally. I mean, the Transcontinental Railroad obviously was constructed by laborers who came from overseas. Obviously not always treated very well, but it was done, and they didn't have the benefit of any machinery that we have today. Eric Eidlin actually is a instructor at San Jose State University at the Mineta Transportation Institute. He also does station planning for the city of San Jose. Eric, what do they do differently? I know you have a lot of experience with high-speed rail in Europe, that they managed to get these projects done, I think, a lot quicker than we do. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think a big part of it, and thank you for the intro, and I'll mention my class is actually happening right now, and they've joined us, so thanks to all of them.
Oh, great. Welcome.
So a couple of things. So these places worldwide with high-speed rail generally, not in every case, but in many cases, in Europe certainly, there is a deep tradition of passenger rail ridership. I mean, I guess you could say going back, we used to have that, but there wasn't quite the break, in places like Germany, Switzerland, France, from that we saw in the US, where, certainly in those places in Europe, auto ownership is pretty widespread, has been, since the 70s at least. But, there was always this sense that, riding the train is a really important way to connect places and to get around. So maybe more political support. And, also related to that, there's always been a need for station design, making sure that the systems that support a station, whether it's the local transit that feeds into it, that all works well. It's not some theoretical thing that in the future, maybe this would be great to have, a rail system that I can depend on to get from, Budapest to Vienna or whatever. But it's actually something that people in their daily lives, they have used, and so they see the urgency, and there's perhaps more political support, which then feeds into real work, and then there's real work, so there are real people trained and experienced in doing these projects.
Yeah, well, and I think to that point, just to hop in, and this is why I think the Central Valley segment is such a crucial part, and it's so great that it's happening, because you travel on 99 now, it's pretty crowded. That's a lot of people are going to be riding on that. And as Boris, you're saying, okay, we have electrifying Caltrain, which high-speed rail is paying for a large part of. Now all of a sudden we have a lot of people on that, and now that goes out to San Jose. That becomes kind of glaringly obvious. It becomes a very easy thing for an assembly member of San Jose and an Ash Cholera of someone like this to say, okay, let's connect these 2 points. And I think you're right about this political will issue of saying, to the BNSF, okay, great, the holidays are important, we still get another week to do construction work or what have you, or okay, well, we'll double down on some mountainside drilling. But yeah, it's kind of building that political support, I think, is a great question.
Well, is that the key? I feel like most Californians at this point, at some point in their lives, have gotten a chance to travel at least to the East Coast of the United States and taken some decent, at least semi-high-speed rail services. If not, they've gone to China or Japan or Europe. But is that the biggest challenge here, that we just got to get people into the right mindset, that they say, hey, we spend $20 billion a year in California on highways, maybe we can spend half of that on rebuilding our rail system?
I think to that point, I think most Californians can barely afford rent. I think most Californians are worried about putting food on the table. Most Californians are struggling. And I think an important part is and the high-speed rail is going to help them. When we talk about job access, when you say, okay, you're having a hard time affording rent, frankly speaking, the high-speed rail project is, in a sense, one of California's biggest bit of affordable housing infrastructure is going on. Personally, as an activist who lives in Oakland, I think we should have a lot more people living in Oakland as well. But the high-speed rail is a housing tool. It's a jobs tool. It's a thing like that. And, I think there needs to be stronger voices helping people kind of put 2 and 2 together that way, because folks are busy, so you got to talk to them and talk to them and say, okay, this is important, and isn't this ridiculous that they have to stop constructing at this hour at this time of year because of this thing? Can we tell your county supervisor to pass an exemption or something like that?
Yeah, actually, when we talked before we actually did the session, Carter, you brought up the idea of working in 24-hour shifts, and having multiple shifts rather than working overnight. Boris, is that something we could do? Look, if this were an existential threat, if it were World War II or something, people just built stuff as fast as they could and all the stops were taken out. What would you say are sort of the first stops that we as political activists should be looking at taking out so this can get built faster?
Well, I guess to your question about, are we doing nighttime construction, for example? And the basic answer is most construction happens from basically 1 hour after sunrise and then until 1 hour before sunset. That's the typical window. There's often restrictions on nighttime construction based on habitat and other things that might be around, or the context within which you're building, whether you're in a community or other folks you might disturb with light or noise during the nighttime. Of course, there's some things like you might be drilling a pile that will take 36 hours and there's nothing you could do. You're going to work through the night on those kinds of things. Yeah. So, I think the number one thing is, and it seems like the basic answer, but having certainty of funding lets you set up a schedule that you can then work to deliver in. And that's the by far the hardest thing on this project is this project has never been fully funded. So when the voters approved it in 2008, they gave us basically 1/5 of the money, and said, hey, we want this high-speed rail system, but go find matching funds somewhere else. Now, we've been, very fortunate, that in the intervening years, we have been able to meet the matching requirements out of that original bond, and advance the program, with strong support throughout the years. But the question of, well, how much do we do now, and how much should we advance each piece, really gets to the schedule, right? It gets to how soon can we see trains? How soon can we extend to the Bay Area or to Los Angeles, out of the Valley? And so those are the kind of practical realities. Of course, there's lots of things about, how do we design tunnels? Do we look at, if we're doing we have several long tunnels that we need to build. Those are some of the long lead time items. Do we have multiple entrance points where tunnel boring machines basically, tunnel towards each other? That's kind of a common technique that gets used on longer tunnel construction. Those kinds of new things and innovation also would need to bring to the construction industry that, for the US and in our system, again, just, we have 3 tunnels that are over 10. There's no rail tunnel in the US that's over 10 miles. And so talking about some of the longest tunnels that would be rail tunnels in North America that would be part of the system. And so we need the innovation that exists elsewhere to be able to be applied here. And we're certainly very cognizant of that and working to bring that over. But those are some of the.
Eric, I know tunnels are a big part of it. Eric, do you want to comment on some of the tunnels in Europe? I know there's the Goddard-based tunnel, the English Channel tunnel. The Japanese have massive train tunnels as well. It seems to me this is not really an unknown. We just have to figure out, who does it best. Who would you say does it best in Europe, and why?
Well, certainly the Swiss and the Austrians have a bit of an advantage there. I was in Europe last month and traveled through the Simplon tunnel, which was the longest for most of last century. That one's 12, but so it was completed around 1900. The expertise does exist globally, and I think that's stuff that we can learn from fairly easily. There are, of course, as Boris will appreciate very well, these rules about hiring, American workers, American content, and those are all well-intentioned, but we obviously should try to find the best balance. But to go back to your earlier point, Roger, you brought up the sense of urgency, like if this were the Second World War. Well, I think a lot of people would say, this last month, July, was the warmest on record, right? And we heard about temperatures off the coast of Florida above 100 Fahrenheit, temperatures in the Mediterranean Sea, 5 degrees Celsius above normal. So some people would say, there is a climate apocalypse in Europe. Many people are, and you might have read about this, are refusing to fly because of the climate implications. They are, traveling by train. So obviously this project will take a long time to build. So the payoff will be in the long term, but I do think we do need to be thinking on that time horizon. It's not just about the greenhouse gas emissions in 5-10 years, but in 30 years. And, how are we setting ourselves up for the future long term?
Well, and also,
Carter, but along those lines, the California's high-speed rail project should be, in my view, seen as sort of a first step. We're going to build a world-class 220 mile per hour rail line between two of the state's 2 biggest cities and its most populous cities in the Central Valley. And I wonder, though, if maybe the approach isn't, at least from a political perspective, and Carter, this is something you can touch on, I think, isn't a little misguided because we've allowed the reporting, and maybe this is my fault too, to focus a little too much on this one line. It should be viewed as just the beginning, and eventually that there'd be a lot of connections, built into it. Brightline West rather to Las Vegas comes to mind, which would eventually join the high-speed rail project. But I wonder, with the growing climate emergency, should we be maybe selling this to the public as a real sea change and how we get around?
Yeah, I think so. To be clear, the number one source of carbon emissions in California is cars, people driving their cars. And so when we're connecting tens of millions of people with high-speed rail, when we're connecting the 6.5 million people who live in the Central Valley with a high-speed rail, this will offset so much. This will get so many cars off the road, which is, hey, for the truckers of the world, great boon to them. But like, this is one of the biggest shifts in carbon emissions. This is a massive, it's not the equivalent of planting a rainforest, but this is planting a huge flipping forest, equivalent of carbon emission. And also, fun fact that like, a lot of people don't know, like the High-Speed Rail Authority has been doing a lot of like mitigation for their construction work. Like there's a lot of, this is a giant tiptoeing very, very gently through communities and all this stuff, which is wonderful. But, I think, we're at a point where people are, protesting autonomous vehicles that are driving in San Francisco because it's more cars on the road. We have people protesting in Oakland yesterday. Oakland is on the course of about to unleash a new carbon bomb by expanding the Oakland airport drastically for a ton more flights. And as Eric's saying, like flying is cooking the planet. And there's so many flights from the Bay Area to LA or Bay Area to Southern California. There's gobs of them. And just displacing those flights with rail is going to be one of the massive things. But when we as rail advocates, when we as justice advocates, when we as climate advocates are talking about this and talking with our friends in other parts of the environmental movement, like I think people have lost the plot about kind of what the rail is and why it's done. And so now that we have a clean energy goal in California and made a ton of progress on clean energy, and we keep needing to do that, but we haven't moved the needle at all on transportation.
Well, I wonder, do people in general realize that a high-speed train doesn't actually have a tailpipe? Like, I wonder, does the average person understand that? When we say it's zero emissions, it really is zero emissions, and it really is potential. We already have the technology. The Europeans are doing this. I mean, the French high-speed rail system, I don't want to get into nuclear power, but it's essentially run on nukes. No CO2 coming out of it at all. So most people are moving around France without generating greenhouse gases. And I wonder, like, maybe Eric or Boris could address that a little bit. Like, is that something we just have to get across to people in the United States and in California?
I think that this project, and both kind of what it is and how we're doing it, has sort of been at least part of California's ambition towards and leadership in trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We made the commitment in 2008 that we would run the system on renewable energy. At that time, that was sort of this, lofty goal, and not a ton had been sort of studied about what's feasible in that regard. I think BART is on their way to running on 100% renewable energy by 2025. What was the lofty goal at one point is now sort of, it's not mundane yet, but it's certainly within reach. And so, I think that California has always positioned itself as a leader on these issues, and continues to take that role. So I think that's still very much part of the bones of what we're doing and how it fits into the overall big picture of what we're trying to do in terms of, as I think Carter was trying to explain, taking cars off the road, taking planes, the air industry is much decarbonized even than cars are. And so this is sort of part of meeting our greenhouse gas goals, is certainly one of the things that we're trying to achieve, along with all the connectivity, economic, other benefits that a system like this offers. Maybe one thing to go back to an earlier question that you're talking about, some of the differences between us and Europe. And the thing that comes to mind for me, or Asia in this regard at least, is that in many ways, high-speed rail projects are sort of the largest projects that governments usually undertake in terms of transportation, certainly. And in other parts of the world, that becomes sort of these national priorities in a way that I don't think we've penetrated yet. Now, I think we're certainly the largest rail construction project anywhere in the country. I can tell you that right now, and probably one of the largest, transportation projects total. But that hasn't, at least to this point, fully reflected sort of the national prioritization of these things. And what I think about is sort of in the, if you go back 50 or 100 years, we've invested trillions into cars. We've invested hundreds of billions into airports. We've invested probably tens of billions into rail. And so what we have in our project is that the state so far has been about 85% of the funding that the project has received has been state funds, with only about 15% from the federal government. When we did the highway system, that was basically the reverse. It was 80 to 90% federal funding for the highway projects.
Can you say that again?
And
Just
so,
wait, Boris,
yeah.
say that again a little bit
Yeah.
slower, a lot louder,
Sure.
please.
So out of the funding that we have so far, about 85% of that has come from the state of California, and 15% has come from the federal government. When we did the highway system over 30, 40 years of highway construction, those ratios were reversed. So the federal government was 80 to 90%, and state governments supported it with about 10% of the needed funding.
And I want to step in on this, particularly about the federal question, because one thing that's been frustrating for me as a person who's traveled throughout California a lot and loves California deeply is, frankly, there's a lot of people who just throw way too much shade on the Central Valley. The Central Valley is larger than 32 other states. Like the Central Valley alone, what's happening at 6.5 million check population thing, like that alone is a massive, gigantic project, and alone is great. We obviously want to do the whole thing. Obviously we will, and we can do it in 5 years. But when people talk about federal funding, just because California isn't balkanized like, all these East Coast states where it's I've gone on runs in the East Coast where you like cross state boundaries. Like it's hard to do that in California. Just like we are still paying the federal government. California has given the federal government billions of dollars in the time period of this project. And so this should be a federal priority. And I think one thing in terms of advocating for that money, of saying, hey, Senator Padilla, hey, we have a Senate race going on right now. Barbara Lee, Katie Porter, and Adam Schiff are going across this country, across the state, trying to tell everyone, vote for me. And a big part is we say, okay, what are you going to do to get the high-speed rail done faster? Because this is a national priority, and when they might say, why? It's like, okay, well, this is one of the biggest things. This is, when we talk about, it was just the 1 year anniversary of the IRA, the big federal funding. And it's like, yeah, this is a cleaner investment. This is going to do more to lower emissions than a lot of other projects. And it can be done in 5 years. And I think a big part that people don't understand is people think that, from just my conversations and seeing the comments on the post when I announced this part, people think construction's happening 24/7. Like people think, the high-speed rail has all the money and it's just getting frittered away. And they don't realize that, like, you have to, sprint to a construction site, do a bunch of things, and then get out of there for BNSF to do whatever they're going to do. Or that, like, various people are able to say, oh no, you can't do this construction work now, and you have to do it elsewhere. Like, they don't realize that 20% of the work has just been fighting to do the work. And that is a huge delay. Like, the last thing,
I think they also don't realize that the federal government has, sort of given billions in matching funds and then cut it off and then tried to claw it back depending on the change in administration. And I wonder, Eric, so we've got high-speed rail in all these other countries with different political systems. I mean, China's political system is pretty different from France's, is, maybe not as different from Spain's, between France and Spain, but how come all these other countries can figure out how to get behind what is to them a basic transportation system, and their federal government will continue to support it, and ours, it's become this highly politicized left versus right battle? Like, that's something I sincerely have never understood. Do you have any sense of it?
Yeah, well, it goes back a little bit to what I was saying. I mean, you mentioned a range of countries. So yeah, China, obviously very strong central government. In Europe, it would be, France also has a very strong central government. For them, high-speed rail was a bit of a space race. It was an issue of national pride being the first in Europe. Certainly it isn't that for us. And then these federal countries like Switzerland or Germany, they do typically, they're governed by, more coalitions, but generally, whether it's right or left, there is a sense that, passenger rail is a real necessity. So maybe that goes back to your earlier question about, like, you said most people, you speculated most people have ridden passenger rail, been to the Northeast or something. I'm not sure everybody, so there's the climate crisis, perhaps that's more a priority for some people than others. Another big focus of this project is building communities around the stations. So there's been a lot of work in Fresno, and we can't underscore enough the importance of doing that correctly, right? And making sure those areas right around the stations, they are not just these vast park and ride lots. We're really making the most of them in terms of economic development. We're making these walkable places, certainly in San Jose, that's what we're trying to do. And, really making for seamless connections by sustainable modes, transit, walk, bike, emerging modes as well. That's really a priority. But so I mean, the more that we can communicate, and the thing is, like, I don't know how many people have really, like, if you've been to Europe, and maybe if you're there on a work trip, you really understand, like, wow, how much I can get done when I'm traveling from Paris to Marseille on the train. Going straight from Gare de Lyon in the center of Paris to Gare Saint-Charles in the center of Marseille, and how much time you save by not having to go to this airport that's way out, in the boonies. I think those things and that experience is maybe a little bit harder to convey, but I think the more we can do that, maybe the more political support we will get, and then all of this, the implementation of the project, I think, gets easier with more public and political support.
And I think to point, like, I think one thing that's important to keep in mind when we talk about California and building things, like, the California housing crisis is deeply connected to our ability or inability to allow things to be built. And when we talk about what's going to happen in Fresno and the hundreds of thousands of people who live there, like, that's a huge draw. That's a huge thing to build around. It's a huge cluster. Like what they've done in the Bay Area in San Francisco, like, that's a great station. All the buses, like, the bus goes near my house across the Bay Bridge, right in there, and then you take an elevator down or staircase and head off to LA, head off to Fresno. And I think a big thing that is important is it's not about Gare de Lyon or all these places. It's saying, hey, you're in Fresno, people in Merced, like, you go to Merced, that's not the edge of the world. You'll just take the train. The train's just going to be the easiest thing, because you're going to look at traffic and you're like, 99, gross. I'll just go to Merced. Like, that, helping people understand that. And I think, like, one thing that's been really interesting is seeing how the high-speed rail kind of tells its story. And I think there's a lot of other folks who need to be telling this story as well, of, like, helping people imagine, you're going to be on the train, and you might not go from SF to LA, but there's a lot of people who go from SF to San Jose, and a lot of people go from Gilroy, and, like, that's big, like, that's a story, and helping people understand that this isn't for their children or their children's future. This is for them, and this is, people have 5-year plans as, like, individuals, and this is part of it.
Yeah, and if I could just piggyback on that quickly. So I think that's one other dimension of high-speed rail, right? And rail generally that, is commonly understood, I think, in other places, but not here, is that, it's something that really allows you to tie together multiple cities, and often, not necessarily the very largest cities, like if you're taking a plane, obviously you're taking off in one city and you're landing in another. You don't have the opportunity to connect all those cities you're flying over. In a train, a high-speed train, you can do it with relatively little travel time penalty. So, the Fresno, Bakersfield, that's a real advantage.
So, and I think this might be back to Carter a little bit, but so how do we sell people in the state, let's say in coastal California, who are not going to have access to a high-speed train unless they really go out of their way, even after the initial segments are built?
Yeah,
Actually,
I think. Go for it.
Sorry, Roger. I just wanted to jump in on this because I think it's. I just want to give a little bit of perspective on where the state is broadly on the project, because I do think it's helpful for table setting and answering the question that you just asked. I mean, a couple different data points just for folks to be aware of. When the project was first approved by the voters, it got 53% of the vote. So 47% of people voted against it. In the most recent polling done by UC Berkeley, the support had risen by a few points, and so was the total support was about 20 points net positive. So about support was in the 50s, opposition was in the 30s at this point. But the other thing that's sort of a useful data point for this question is, and again, it comes back a little bit to the federal funding, but in the bipartisan infrastructure law, it actually did create a new pot of intercity rail funds for the first time since the Recovery Act in 2009 at the federal level. And so we currently have a pretty large $3 billion application in to that funding program. And we've had tremendous support with it. So we've had, obviously support from this administration, but also the previous two governors, Democrat and a Republican. We've had support from 36 members of Congress, both senators. And so this, to say that there isn't a push behind this from California, we see it every day. There's still always going to be more to do, but I think California is pretty united in wanting to see this project happen. There's all the questions of, how much can we do, how fast, and I'm glad we're having this conversation about that topic. But I do want to, make sure that we, at least at the table of that. The support is there, and we're very lucky to have that, because there's no way to move something like this forward without very, very strong support, and we've certainly had that across the board.
And that's, I think, such a key part. Like, there is support there, and it's about mobilizing it. So for the folks listening in, when was the last time you called the governor and said, "Hey, I want the high-speed rail done in 5 years"? Like, you can Google Gavin Newsom phone number, you get his office number, you call him and do that. Like, that's what it looks like. There is currently, and I've checked around, like, there isn't a petition right now where people could say, "Hey, I want the high-speed rail done now." Like, there's a petition to get a crosswalk on the street near my house, and there is not a petition in support of one of the largest pieces of infrastructure going on in America, and definitely the one in California. Like, there is a grassroots mobilization, which does make it easier for folks to say, like, as you're saying, like, Monterey County, like, all these places, helping out. There's this great effort in Santa Cruz to get a rail line there. And because, going over 17 to San Jose is really hard, and they're going to link up to Gilroy. And guess what? When you link up to Gilroy, Gilroy is a gateway to the world for a lot of these folks. And it's going to be. And I think when you talk about mobilizing this, whether it's from a climate perspective, which is, hey, you would like emissions to go down. This is the largest single thing that California could do to lower emissions in a pretty massive way and move the needle. If it's from just a pure physics perspective, like, we're not gonna widen the one. We're not gonna double the width of 101. It's just not happening. Yeah. That is a lot. That when you talk about hundreds of billions of dollars, that's hundreds of billions of dollars. And I think helping people recognize that they win, and when this happens, is a key part, because as Boris is saying, like, this isn't a technical issue. Like, there are mountains, they need hills drilling. As Eric's saying, there are hole drilling, or I guess boring is the word. There's boring machines they can bore through. And as Boris is saying, it's like, okay, should we do a double side bore like they did in the channel, like a tunnel, in Sierra Nevada, is like, you can walk into the old rail tunnel there where they did a 4-side. They did 2, and then they dropped a shaft and did it this way. That's probably outdated, and fancy machinery wouldn't allow that. But, like, we have technical things to do this, and we are a lot closer to being meaningfully done than I think people think about it. And so I think for, the part it's important to know is that, like, if the folks who are listening in want this, like, we got to fight for it. And I think in terms of, like, we got some,
I want to stop you there, because we're starting. By the way, if people see me looking down, I've been communicating with our tech guy, trying to figure out how to get the questions across. But okay, so feeding into what we were just talking about, what can average people do to get the feds to sort of get on track with this? I mean, I remember in 2008, there was a grassroots push. People were out gathering signatures to get the high-speed rail project started. Now, what do we do, especially when it comes to the federal government, to get it built faster, get it finished, and carry on from there?
So for the next couple of months, and I'll take this as just Carter Laffin, transportation activist, so I can say, I don't work for the high-speed rail. I don't work for the city of San Jose. I could say all sorts of things. Right now, California has a shocking a unique situation politically going on in which we have three people who are in who are in Congress, who are running for Senate, and they are all saying, hey, vote for me. If you are a person who is a registered voter in California and registered to vote, and if you're registered as a Democrat, you have probably gotten a text from Katie Porter's campaign, from Adam Schiff, from Barbara Lee. You're probably going to get calls soon if you haven't done it. You'll be getting mailers. You'll be getting everything. And if you want the high-speed rail, saying to them, what are you going to do to get the high-speed rail done sooner? What have you done to support this project? And it's great that they've signed on to letters, and Barbara Lee's people have done a lot of stuff, and they'll probably say, oh, Congresswoman Lee has done X, Y, and Z. And you say, great, I'd like to hear more of this. And injecting this into that election is such a huge way to say, okay, when we go for this vote, there's all these horse tradings that go on in DC. There's all this stuff going on. Maybe it gets tacked onto a Ukrainian aid package, which, by the way, the federal government came up with $80 billion for Ukraine aid, which is great, and we should. And helping reduce oil consumption in California is a good way of helping, hurt Putin hit Putin where it hurts. But we need to ask a lot louder for this stuff, and that's a great way to that's a great wedge point just in the next couple of months.
Just put rail transportation on the same financial footing as highways and airports.
Yeah,
I mean, that would be enough that we could,
Yeah. And I'm looking at Boris's background, which, when people are listening to the podcast, maybe they don't see it, but this is a beautiful structure of the high-speed rail going over the freeway. And the question is, is that a piece of high-speed rail infrastructure, or is that a piece of freeway infrastructure? And it's like, well, who paid for it? The Highway Authority could have paid for it. I don't know if they chipped in, but you made their lives a lot better. Boris is shaking his head for those of you who are just on audio. And telling the highway people, or telling one thing that I've learned in just prepping for this that's been shocking is the amount of money the high-speed rail folks have had to pay PG&E because they're having PG&E move wires that PG&E was going to probably do anyway. And just saying, hey, PG&E, no, you split that cost, go 50-50, whatever, 70-30, cuts tens of billions, tons of this off of it.
So I wanted to get some of the audience questions in here. I think this is a Boris question, but so since Carter talked about PG&E, how much of the electrical infrastructure is going to be controlled and operated by the High-Speed Rail Authority, and how much of it is outsourced?
Well, definitely looking to have our facilities, for example, our stations, to be net zero energy. So basically that they can generate the energy on site for their use. We also have a pretty extensive plan for solar and battery use for the actual train itself. And then anything else might need, and this is sort of our work with how we tie into the rest of the grid and make sure that we have resilient systems with everything else, is that combination of having renewable energy from the grid as well as what we actually can generate ourselves and store ourselves, so that, as we've all kind of experienced the last few years, there's times when the grid is fully available, and that's reality for some parts of the year. And so we want to make sure that our system is resilient to those kinds of disruptions. And so that's where battery storage and other things come in to ensuring that reliability, even when something might be going wrong.
I want to be clear, you're talking about battery banks on the land, not on the train.
Yes, not on the trains. The trains will be powered by overhead system. So the power for that overhead catenary system has to be brought from somewhere. And if and at times it might need to be stored somewhere for a period of time before use, basically. And so that's where that interconnectivity to the grid comes in. That's where those battery storage facilities come in.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, the project is also a major, massive transmission line that's being built throughout California. This is not just the high-speed rail, it is the longest tunnels in North America for trains, and it's also this gigantic it's this gigantic power line, and I think there's all sorts of other benefits to that. Well,
Boris, I mean, a positive side effect of the project is it's making a stronger electrical grid for the state of California, isn't that right? I mean, the overhead wires are part of the grid.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, look, I think the bottom line of having a long linear core across the state has various potential uses and benefits in electrical or fiber or other things that, we're always looking for right of ways essentially. And this is the first new major right of way created in the state, probably since the aqueducts and the highway system were built. I mean, those are the last couple that I can think of. And so every time you do one of these, you have opportunities to leverage that investment that's being made. But that's, part of what's new and different here is just the scale of creating a new guideway, creating a new right of way is massive. And that's, I think, what sometimes gets lost. I mean, 119 miles. The last time we did 119 miles of a new rail line, the Ford Model T was the #1 selling car. I mean, this these are not things that we do every day.
And it's also, and I live in Oakland.
I have an audience question that fits right into that. Okay, but Boris, I know the answer to this, but the audience would, I'd certainly like to know. Is there someplace they can go and see a drone flyover of the right of way that you've built thus far? And I know the answer is yes, but do you have that information? We can put it in the.
Sure.
On the YouTube.
Yeah, the simple answer is there's a website, buildhsr.com, and it has, I mean, I don't know how many hours of drone video and how many thousands of photos at this point of all the various construction. I mean, what you could see again, for those watching on with the video, but what's behind me is a drone photo of one of our structures. And so we have lots of information there. We also have lots of videos on our YouTube channel. So if you search California High-Speed Rail Authority on YouTube, you'll find, again, hundreds of construction videos and other information about the project.
I also going to put a plug for the Instagram account. I've started following the Instagram account because it's like the drone footage, but they have lo-fi beats. So, for you Zoomers and your lo-fi beat videos, it's kind of nice.
Yeah, and I think this is Boris and Eric, but it's my understanding and you really see this from the drone footage, when you've got those 100 miles of repaired right away and most of the bridges and flyovers finished, the actual laying of the track doesn't take that long. Like it's mostly automated. And I've seen films of these machines at work in Europe and in Asia, and they basically it's itself a long train that basically just kind of hurls the next layer of tracks and rails in front of it, and you just sort of feed raw materials into one end, and you get tracks coming out the other. Am I oversimplifying a bit? I'm sure, but.
Well, it's a little bit simplified because there's other things that go with it, but the basic point, and again, I think this is the lessons, and we've done a lot of reforms about how we stage our delivery and how we actually manage the project, and that's been kind of one of the key things over the years, and certainly under this administration that we've been implementing. But once you're essentially out of the ground, so once you've built the civil works, the structures, the guideway itself, you're kind of you have much more control of your own destiny. So when I talked about in the beginning those veto points and all the prior rights issues and all those interactions with the kind of external world that might stop you from doing things, you might still have requirements. You might still have no nighttime work in sensitive habitat or community areas or something like that. But you have much more of that universal access of doing the work when you need it and being able to go sequentially down the line. We're going to lay track at however many hundreds of feet per day, and we're just going to keep doing that until we get to the end. And so it's a much more straightforward construction work that needs to happen.
Well, and that's to the point about the kind of original prompt and question of 5 years, could this happen? And I think a big part's look, there's 3-ish complicated tunnels to be done, which can all be done at the same time. That would be a big thing. But the high-speed rail has done the vast majority of the hard work of lining up the shot. That this is a little bit of to make a cake from scratch. First, you have to create the universe. That the amount of there wasn't a train there that we just had to upgrade, except for in the case of San Francisco down at San Jose and then to Gilroy, in which that is an easy. I mean, I'm not doing the work, but that's easy work because it's an existing track, it's an existing thing. Let's do that. One of the things I'm very impressed by is the Los Angeles Union Station. LA is getting a new station. I guess, and Eric could talk about this a lot, but LA is getting a new station basically entirely because of this project. And I used to live in downtown San Jose, and what you're doing over there, Eric, is pretty massive too.
Well, San Francisco got a new station too. It's just not connected, but
connected with a bunch of bus lines. It's great.
Ground, so nobody sees
We're,
it,
we're
but-
working on it. It's moving forward.
Yeah.
It's advanced.
Hey, so with very little time left, now all the questions are coming in, but I think this is Boris and Eric. You know, we've seen kind of a new model of higher speed trains and potentially a high speed train with Brightline West between Vegas and the Los Angeles area. Rancho Cucamonga, I think, is where it's going to go to. But is this kind of new model of privatization with passenger rail, does it have the potential to change how the California project gets done, or to speed it up, or to give it any advantages?
Why don't you go first, Boris?
I mean, I guess what else? I think it's an interesting question. Certainly, Brightline was some, very nice higher-ish speed service in Florida. For high-speed rail projects, and this is what we've seen internationally, is that the major barrier to a private entity developing these things is the upfront capital cost. The costs are just very big. And so while lots of systems operate on a commercial basis, so basically they can pay for their own operations, they can even generate, revenue and profit out of the fare box, the upfront investment almost always has to come from the public sector. And so, how much is Brightline still talking about a fully private project in Southern California? I mean, they've applied for the same federal funding that we've applied for. So they're looking for about, $3.75 billion out of that program. They've also, the right of way for them has been through an agreement with the state of California to use the median of I-15. I mean, could you have any better luck than that in terms of right of way acquisition and needs? And so, so I guess the bottom line is, if Brightline West is to happen, it sounds like even they've kind of come around to the view that it might be led by a private entity, but we'll have to have substantial necessity of the independence on the public sector. And so from our vantage point, we think that kind of the public sector has to play a lead role on these things. It's just too big of a piece of public infrastructure to happen without the public sector. It doesn't mean that we, don't want to tap into private innovation, or don't, for example, for us, we've had Deutsche Bahn, which is the German rail operator, as a potential early operator for our system. And so we certainly see the operations side, lots of roles for the private sector in some of that. So I think it's finding the right balance in the right areas where the public sector can do something better, that we should do it on the public side, and where the private sector might have some advantages, we should find ways to leverage that.
Eric, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I pretty much agree with what Boris said. I will say, though, it is encouraging that there is an entity like Brightline proposing on these projects like LA to Las Vegas, which is, by common wisdom, that is a good high-speed rail corridor. The distances, and they obviously they pulled off this project in Florida. It's got some challenges with grade crossings and so on, but that they're a real credible private sector entity. So we'll see.
Well, and to that point, I'll say just, fundamentally, it's good that Brightline's stepping in and doing one of the easiest projects that could be an easy higher speed rail project in a place that's connecting two cities along an existing right of way. And that's great. And the federal government should give the California high speed rail and also Brightline some money, because guess what? An aircraft carrier is $14 billion. Like, the idea of scarcity around funding is a total myth. Total myth. The United States is the richest country in the world. We have more than enough money to say, hey, Brightline, hey, California high-speed rail, let's do it. I think for some people who, are watching the projects and they maybe get confused about what's going on, the California high-speed rail is doing, they're not demolishing Fresno to build the rail line, which in the 50s is what happened. Like, I live in Oakland. My city is a city scarred by freeway construction, where the city just can't, like, when the federal government and state entities said, let's just demolish this. Thousands and thousands of people were displaced. That's not happening here. And I think that's really important for that to be acknowledged. And so I think in terms of federal funding, the answer is yeah. And it's saying to Barbara Lee and Katie Porter and Adam Schiff, like, there should not be the high-speed rail and Brightline competing for this. It should be them both. The government should be able to say, yeah.
Yeah, and so could
sure,
I just quickly to Boris's bigger point about the important public sector role. So one thing that is worrisome about this Brightline proposal, right, is their terminus in Rancho Cucamonga, which by what it seems like is going to be this huge park and ride lot, and there doesn't it's very expensive to extend it deeper into LA, but ultimately to deliver the benefits of high-speed rail, like I talked about that trip earlier from Paris to Marseille, you're not going to get that with the station in Rancho Cucamonga. It's just too far east for most people in the LA basin. So yeah, it's not enough.
But just so listeners understand, California High-Speed Rail, Amtrak, the commuter rail in Los Angeles and San Francisco, they are on the same gauge of track. So there are opportunities either for people to transfer between different systems or for the trains themselves to continue on each other's trackage. So it's as systems are built out, there's going to be more flexibility, but there aren't basically
gauge
barriers
wars.
There aren't gauge wars. It's not like BART where you can't run an Amtrak on BART's tracks and vice versa. It actually is being built fortunately all these systems are being built in a standard way.
And I'm glad you bring up BART, because one of the things that keeps coming up is this concept of like stable funding. And BART and other just basic existing transit systems across California were under threat this summer. Gavin Newsom proposed a $4 billion cut to transit funding, and there's a huge statewide effort to push back. Some of you may have seen the protests around this, but we generated 10,000 calls and letters into Sacramento, into the Capitol, to demand that and reverse those cuts.
We need to do that with high-speed rail and keep it up.
It was 10,000 calls and letters, and that got $1 billion. And it's like, so when we talk about how much money, like how many calls and letters do we need to do to get more than $1 billion, it's more calls and letters. And I think one of the things, though, like BART, to the ridership and park and ride, like BART is in the process of converting all these parking lots into housing developments and solve this crisis. And they are making money off of that. That is helping them fiscally do that. Frankly, I don't know if the High-Speed Rail Authority has that legal authority to do that soon, but like giving you all the ability to do that would be a huge boon economically.
Well, I mean, I want to be mindful of people's time, because we're just about, we're actually a little bit over at this point. But yeah, and I mean, famously, the high-speed rail systems in Japan are actually supported by the real estate. They're basically real estate enterprises, and it sounds like Brightline in Florida, actually, that's their model as well. Is they've built a lot of real estate in Miami and other cities that'll, really support the whole system. So, any last thoughts from Eric, Boris, and Carter?
Well, I'll just quickly echo. So we need a greater sense of urgency and public and political purpose around this project. We're going to need more money. And I do think we do need more money also in what we used to call the bookends. So, this perception that all the money is going to the Central Valley. There's going to be, given how long it's going to take to build out the system, I think other parts of the state are going to need to feel of the benefits. And we need to get better at how we're delivering this. And I'll just give a shout out to the Oxford scholar Ben Fluvier, who has been in the media a lot recently, but he has a recipe for how we could do better and is getting attention. He was just in a webinar with the Secretary of USDOT, so some of his ideas are getting some traction, and I think some of them would apply to this project.
Great. Boris?
I mean, I would just say that I know that there's this sort of Christmas morning view of the project sometimes of, I voted for this thing in 2008. Why isn't it here already? And I think this, I'm glad we're having this conversation about sort of the being able to lift the veil a little bit on sort of why is it so hard to do these big things, and what are the trade-offs and values that we have. But I think it's always useful to look at that lots has been done, been laid, and from my perspective, given how much has already been built, the main question at this point is, how much of a high-speed rail system we can have, how fast, but it's no longer the question of, are we going to have a high-speed rail system in California? And maybe that's not as satisfactory to others as it is to me, but sort of crossing the viability threshold in this particular context, I think is a huge thing. And so we can still debate, what should we do next and how fast should we do it and all those things. But being past the point where you can just say, we're not going to do this anymore, I think is a huge game changer. And I want to keep that kind of perspective out for folks of just where the program is at this point is sort of past the point of no return.
We're well beyond that now. Yeah.
And I think that's
yeah, Carter, just like what's the political takeaway here?
Yeah, and I think, if you're listening to this and you're a California high-speed rail hater, hopefully this opened your eyes. Hopefully you have a little bit of faith. And the thing, honestly, for the person listening in who might not like the project or has hard feelings, I think the question to ask yourself is, do you want the project done now or do you want it done later? And if you say, look, I just want it done, great, make the call Governor Newsom. It's a 916 number. You can Google it and you get it and say, I just want the flipping thing done. And you can do that. And if you're someone who says, okay, no, I like the project and I want it done sooner, it's like, great. You can also call the governor. You can also call your assembly member and your state senator and your county supervisor. And you're going to start getting a lot more contact from all these people running for Senate for your vote, register to vote. Tell them, say, I want this and I want this now. I don't want this in 20 years. I don't want this in 30. Stop telling me my kids and my kids' kids. I want this now, because the project is at this point where, we can make the federal government and the state government can step in and buy the boring machines, step in and do a lot of this stuff and get it done quickly. And it's something that it's on us as the people who want it to write the petition, make the petition, fill it out, make the call, do that stuff, talk to a friend about it. Because I think as like Boris and Roger and Eric and people who've been tracking the project really closely for a long time, like one thing I want to flag, since 2008, a lot of there's a lot of new Californians. A lot of people are alive today who weren't alive during that vote. A lot of people have migrated to California who weren't, that a lot of people have left California. The project, and we all as people who care about this have to continuously reintroduce people to it and explain that this is the largest piece of carbon, this is the largest piece of climate progress that California is working on right now. That it is ready to go and can be done a lot faster if it was given more permission and money to do so. And that us as individuals or people in your church groups or business groups or what have you can tell elected officials, hey, we need this thing ASAP. And that's what it takes. And we can do that.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Sorry about the technical glitches we had at the opening end of this, but I think everything went well. And we'll be having many more meetings like this over the next 5 years, 6 years, maybe more.
5 years. There we go.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, so much for your time.
Everybody.
Appreciate it.
Good
Okay.
night.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, folks.
Bye.